Okay, so welcome to young adulthood. Generally, we're talking about people in their late 20s and their 30s, but we want to just keep in mind that some people really skip emerging adulthood because they move into marriage and children, in their late teens or early 20s. So when we think about what makes an adult, we've talked about this some with emerging adulthood, but generally it's things like having more responsibility for yourself, making more independent decisions, being financially independent. And then, of course, there's cultural variations. So in China and Korea, it's about supporting your parents. In India, it's about demonstrating emotional self-control. In Israel, it might be more about completing your military service. In traditional cultures, it might be about marriage. And I suspect, for example, here in the United States, if we look at the subculture of Mormon men and women, a piece of it, especially for Mormon men, might be completing your mission. So first, let's turn our attention to physical development. So here's the upside of physical development in your late 20s and 30s. In general, there's little decline in your athletic ability. Physical functioning, which generally peaked in emerging adulthood, still remains high, and your immune system is still pretty strong. And you have the benefits of you're not engaging in as many risky behaviors like unprotected sex or binge substance use or risky driving. And you have a general low risk of heart disease and many other diseases. Okay, so then the downside is that the clear signs of aging usually begin in the 30s, and there's a range in what people experience, but many people in their 30s already have graying hair. Many men in their 30s already have thinning hair and receding hairlines. People in their 30s start to notice that their skin seems to be looser, more wrinkly. The lower human growth hormone is associated with that, as well as less kind of collagen. So skin is less elastic. And you may have noticed this if you've ever done kind of a skin pinch test by just pinching the skin on the top of your hand, and people doing that at different ages. The older you are, the more when you pinch the skin, it kind of hangs there, right? And keeps the pinched shape before it slowly kind of falls back into, more smoothness. The younger you are, the faster that happens. Cholesterol is starting to accumulate in arteries, which is going to be associated with later heart disease. And already we're seeing declines in T cells and B cells, which means that it starts to take longer to recover from injuries, and you're more likely to get sick, and you have a slower kind of recovery time. I noticed, for example, just rates of healing for minor skin injuries. When my kids were babies, especially my son, he was a thumb sucker, and so in trying to get his thumb in his mouth, he often kind of scratched up his face with his fingernails, because babies' fingernails are really hard to cut well without cutting them. And so he would get little tiny cuts all over his face from his fingernails, and initially I was like, oh my gosh, that's terrible. But then what I noticed is that they were gone in like a day or two, whereas if I got those same little cuts on my face now in my 40s, those would be there for, a week. And if my mom did it, in her 70s, it would be even longer. So a student once asked why hair turns gray, and it's about melanin, which is different than melatonin. So melanin that gives your skin and hair kind of its color, gets worn out for hair. And it can be different for each person, kind of how long it lasts. But once the melanin is exhausted in a hair follicle, then the hair turns gray. And so more bad news is that weight gain generally increases in your late 20s and 30s. And this is because of a few different things. One is that the change in your basal metabolic rate. So basically the amount of energy your body uses at rest has now declined. So you either have to eat less or exercise more in order to maintain the same weight. Of course, weight gain is also associated with genetics. So monozygotic twins are more similar in body weight than dizygotic twins, even when raised apart. Even eating, the same diet, people vary in how much weight they can take off or put on. And research is investigating, what that's about. It could be about kind of genetics and how your body uses or regulates leptin, which helps your body figure out when it's full or not, or ghrelin, which helps your body know when it's hungry. And then, of course, diet and SES, like we've talked about. And so if we are overweight or obese, that does put us, as we all know, and hear about, at risks for different kind of diseases, processes like high blood pressure, or diabetes, and even cancer. But it also puts us more at risk for sleep disorders, which later, as we'll see, can put us at risk for dementia, often sets us up for some workplace discrimination or struggles to find a romantic partner. And being obese is also correlated with depression. And it's hard to know kind of what comes first there. Those things can be kind of a cycle that feeds on itself. The more depressed you are, the harder it is to exercise and eat well, the more weight you gain, and then that kind of just keeps cycling. So exercise, which we are going to talk about repeatedly in this class, also has the benefit of increasing basal metabolic rate, so that can help offset the decreases that are associated with aging. Exercise, as you probably hear, is associated with reduced risk of many diseases like some cancers, heart disease, diabetes. Exercise also releases endorphins, which are endogenous opioids. So it's, obviously we hear a lot about the opioid crisis in the United States, but you can take exogenous opioids, like a drug, but your body actually produces opioids, and endorphins are one of those. And so they're produced, right, as associated with exercise or excitement or in response to pain or consumption of food or love and orgasm, right? And so these are things that help us feel good, and they are produced by more intense exercise. Generally, what the research says is that you have to reach a level of discomfort in your exercise in order for endorphins to be released. So as a moderate amount of intensity or duration. And these can stay in our bodies for up to 24 hours and even continue to influence digestive hormones. So exercise overall is correlated with higher levels of well-being and lower rates of anxiety and depression. It can also help us control persistent pain, cravings for chocolate and other addictive substances, and helps reduce feelings of stress and frustration. So just a reminder to get out there and do your thing. Caffeine, one of my favorite things. So there's a lot of benefits to caffeine. It's correlated with less anxiety and depression, less fatigue. It can help people focus in the short term. It is also an exercise and coordination enhancer, but it is a banned substance, for example, by the NCAA for college athletes. So a urinary caffeine concentrate exceeding 15 micrograms per milliliter results in a positive drug test. This is about the equivalent of ingesting about 500 milligrams, which is, like maybe 5 to 6 cups of brewed coffee within a few hours before performance. Coffee has some specific benefits. In particular, in terms of research, it reduces the risks of some forms of cancer like liver cancer, type 2 diabetes, Parkinson's, and heart disease. There is some emerging research suggesting that it helps burn fat, although I think that is going to need more research. It is correlated with a longer lifespan. But the costs are, and they vary for people, but caffeine addiction. And so once your body acclimates to this substance, right, then it can experience withdrawal symptoms when you don't get your normal amount of caffeine. So headaches, irritability, fatigue, inability to concentrate. And this can happen just, on even throughout the day, where, you might experience kind of a down in the afternoon once your caffeine wears off. And as we're going to see on the next slide, for regular heavier caffeine users, their brain activity just isn't as high if they don't have their usual dose of caffeine. Caffeine can result in sleep disturbances. The half-life of caffeine, it depends on the person and how much, but it's maybe around 5 hours. Some people say 8, which is why you'll hear some people say they can't have caffeine after, noon or 1 or 2. And then caffeineism is, considered a physical dependence on caffeine, and also associated with excessive intake of caffeine. So having symptoms like restlessness, nervousness, excitement, insomnia, GI upset, muscle twitching, kind of rambling, thought and speech, cardiac arrhythmia. And so, for example, my dad, one Christmas holiday season, we got an espresso machine, and I was making everybody, espresso and cappuccinos when I was back home. And my dad ended up thinking he was having a heart attack because he had a really fast heart rate, and went to the hospital, spent Christmas Eve in the hospital essentially, whereas it could have been, just induced by having extra caffeine. All right, so this is from an old National Geographic, but I've never found pictures as good as were in this issue, so I've kept using them. So what they did is they put people through brain scans, and some people who had a heavy kind of dose of caffeine, usually about 3 12-ounce cups of coffee, and then people who didn't normally have much caffeine. And so you can see when they put people on the first picture who didn't usually have much caffeine, and they hadn't had any caffeine, their brain was decently lit up. And then the second picture is people who normally have a heavy amount of caffeine who had their caffeine, and you can see that their brain was even a little bit better lit up, which shows us kind of the advantages of caffeine. But then you can see in the last picture those heavy users without caffeine, and how their brain was pretty dark. It was even less lit up than the people who don't usually have caffeine, who didn't have it. And so I often think that that's what, if you're a regular caffeine user, that's what it can feel like when you haven't yet had your caffeine, right? Your brain is dark and you just don't feel like you're functioning very well. So there's a few different genes involved in how people process caffeine, which is why some of us, experience more effects than others. And so one gene that has been studied the most is the CYP1A2 gene, which influences how quickly your liver metabolizes caffeine. And you can have, there's a fast variant of the gene and a slow variant of the gene. And so if you have 2 alleles of this gene, one from each biological parent, that means that you have the potential to have 2 fast variants, 2 slow variants, or 1 of each. And so fast metabolizers are those that had 2 fast variants, about 40% of people that have been studied. And for them, that's generally a good thing, being a fast metabolizer. Higher caffeine is not correlated with a risk of heart attack or high blood pressure, and generally is correlated with greater improvements in your exercise speed. For slow metabolizers, either those that had 2 slow variant alleles or 1 slow and 1 fast, then higher caffeine is more risky. It could put them more at risk for heart attack and high blood pressure, and it doesn't lead to as many improvements in exercise. All right, so switching into cognitive development for just a few slides. Okay, so we've seen dramatic changes for women in the workforce over the last, 50 years. So as we've talked about, it used to be that you could, if you were a woman in the 1960s, you could be a secretary, a teacher, a nurse, house cleaner, a flight attendant, right? But now there's increased women in all areas, especially in fields like medicine or law, veterinary medicine, where we still see what's called occupational sex segregation, where there's, dramatically different rates of men and women in careers, is for STEM and construction fields are more likely to be men, and service and care work is still more likely to be women. And so generally, we have paid better for construction work, mechanics, things like that, than we have for taking care of people. So we generally pay better for taking care of things than we do for people. And so this means that women are still earning quite a bit less and in lower status jobs. All right, so let's talk more about cognitive changes that are happening in your late 20s and 30s. So the first one is that you are building expertise. And as we're going to see, it's not going to peak until we get into middle adulthood, but you're certainly building that in your late 20s and 30s. It is suggested that it takes about maybe 10 years in most fields to really develop expertise. And this can be particularly frustrating when you're starting off in a field, because you feel this enormous pressure to know what to do and how to do things, and yet you just haven't had enough experience. And I remember feeling this a lot as a beginning therapist, that I wish I knew more, and I was challenged to feel like I knew what I was doing. And so the benefit is, as the further you move in young adulthood, the more expertise you develop. And so the more you have exposure to a specific area, the more you can kind of anticipate problems and address them more efficiently and quickly. I noticed that the more I've taught a class or had an assignment, the more detailed my syllabi become, the more detailed my assignment guidelines or my rubrics become, because I know what problems are likely to come up, and I'm trying to kind of head them off at the pass. Frontal lobe maturity also helps promote that expertise. And then creativity is kind of occurring in conjunction with expertise. So with expertise, you're able to go from kind of problem solving to kind of problem finding or anticipating, and you can start to create new things that can be valuable to you or to others. So creativity basically refers to a phenomenon where somebody creates something new, a product, a solution, artwork, a joke that has some kind of value. And so creativity actually peaks a little bit earlier than expertise on average, so in the late 30s and 40s, because there is some rigidity that can develop in our brains as we get older that can make it a little bit harder to keep thinking outside the box and being creative. But of course, these are just averages, and there can be a lot of individual variation. I always thought this was a funny image of how to be an expert, and that it takes a lot of kind of time and repetition, and it's really challenging to make it past the suck threshold, right? And so there's a lot of things that I just could never make it past the suck threshold, like playing tennis. I've tried to learn to play tennis so many times, but I always suck and I give up, right? So there's a lot of pros and cons to getting older, but some of the pros are feeling like you might actually have some expertise. So now we're on to emotional and social development. So returning to Erikson, called young adulthood early adulthood, and this time of intimacy versus isolation. And so one of the developmental tasks throughout adulthood, but perhaps particularly in emerging and young adulthood, is to establish basically a committed long-term romantic relationship. And not everybody wants to do that or does do that, but that is a common task at this developmental stage. And intimacy can also include connections to friends and family. It doesn't always have to be a romantic partner. So there's a researcher by the name of David Buss who's been doing cross-cultural research on what people are looking for in a mate around the world for many decades. And this model has really been, it's basically heterosexist. It's been assumed that men were looking for traits in women and women were looking for traits in men. So I'm not sure how well David Buss did a good job of kind of clarifying whether or not people identified as gay or straight in their attractions. But what you can see is that for men and women around the world currently, there's a lot of similarity in what they are looking for in a mate. In fact, the first four things are the same for men and women. Sometimes what gets said in the media are things like men are looking for women who have, attractive appearance, and women are looking for men who have good financial prospects. But what you can see is that those rankings are lower on the lists for both men and women, and they're really not that different. So again, the takeaway is that over time, men and women have gotten more similar in what they're looking for in a mate than different. This is a famous theory, Sternbergs' triangular theory of love, which basically says we have three elements associated with love. We have passion, we have intimacy, and we have commitment. And I think ideally, right, in our romantic relationships, we manage to have all three, which is that consummate love where you've got them all. But you can have different versions, right, where you just have passion, or you just have intimacy, or you just have kind of commitment, but not a lot of passion or intimacy for each other, or you could have combinations of those. And so if you look at these three elements of romantic relationships, according to Sternberg, intimacy develops kind of gradually and can keep going over time. Passion usually spikes earlier and then kind of declines and maybe recovers or stays a little bit steady. And then commitment develops often over time and then can kind of level off. And so then this has implications for arranged marriages, which we're going to talk about on the next slide. Okay, so then arranged marriages, just keeping in mind that throughout in history, most marriages used to be arranged, and it's only in kind of Western cultures, in the last several hundred years that marriages have been about love and not about kind of property or status or combining, family resources or, due to kind of religious rules. So, but now in some cultures there is still kind of arranged marriages, but now it's more common for it to be semi-arranged. So the people who are getting married are able to kind of give their input on who they would like to marry. It's not just the parents deciding. But in arranged marriages, as you might imagine, commitment comes first because it has been decided you're committed to each other, and then intimacy and passion will develop over time. So divorce is most likely in young adulthood because divorce is most likely to happen within the first 10 years of marriage. So it was interesting for me to spend my 20s kind of going to my friends' weddings, and then in my 30s and early 40s hearing about my friends, getting divorced. Divorce is high in the United States, although we're not the highest. And then it's rare in many cultures around the world. So it's rare in Asia, Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, and Southern Europe. So why is the divorce rate so high in the US? Because we have placed an emphasis on marrying for love. Then if you are no longer in love, you can get a divorce. Certainly the no-fault divorce laws that passed state by state in the 1970s made it easier for people to get a divorce. It didn't have to be someone's fault anymore. You didn't have to prove that someone had been abusive or was an alcoholic or had abandoned the family or had committed adultery. You could just say it was due to irreconcilable differences. Increased opportunities for women have allowed women to get more education, to be in the workforce, and to be able to financially support themselves. And women are more likely to file for divorce in the United States, so it gives women an out if they're unhappy. Lower religious involvement is often correlated with more divorce, although some research has shown that in some religious groups, divorce rates can be just as high. And currently in the United States, we're seeing an increased risk of divorce among individuals who have less money and education. So divorce rates are higher among people who have less money, not as high among people who have more. And so the thinking is that it's this influence of financial stress that creates challenges for couples and increases conflict and then leads to more risks of divorce. Okay, so just in the last 20 years, we've seen some major shifts in historical trends regarding women's education and marriage and divorce. So prior to 2000, college-educated women were basically paying a penalty. They were less likely to get married and more likely to divorce. But by 2010, college-educated women were still less likely to marry, but also now became less likely to divorce. And then just a couple of years later, it shifted completely. College-educated women just as likely or perhaps more likely now to marry and less likely to divorce. So that's good news for all the women in the class who are hoping to get married. So you may have heard things like being married is associated with benefits like physical health and psychological well-being. And that has been kind of a common finding in HDFS, that being single was correlated with higher mental and physical problems. But recent researchers have been reanalyzing and kind of re-looking at that and saying that the negative effects of being single have really been overstated. When we look at happiness specifically, you can see there that never married young adults are actually happier than those adults who were divorced or unhappily married. So if you are happily married, you may have some advantages, but if you've been unhappily married, then actually there's more disadvantages. And once we start controlling for things like social support, for single people, then those differences between being married and single also decrease. So let's transition into talking about same-sex marriage specifically, and we can see that around the world, starting in the year 2000, we began legalizing same-sex marriage, and every year we add a few more countries. So for a long time, the research on same-sex couples really was focused on kind of comparing them to straight couples. And research has moved beyond now and is just starting to study same-sex couples in and of themselves without having to compare them to straight couples, which is kind of basically a form of heteronormativity, that heterosexual is the norm, and then we compare being in a same-sex relationship to that. But that research still persists, and it still is interesting to think about what are the similarities and differences regarding sexual orientation. And so what this research has said is that same-sex couples and straight couples are generally similar in that they are in committed relationships. They report similar levels of relationship closeness and satisfaction, and perhaps most interestingly, they still negotiate gendered identities and roles. So even in a same-sex couple where both people might have the same gender identity in terms of being a man or a woman, it doesn't mean that household labor has now been decided for them. Same-sex couples still have to decide, is one of them taking on the more stereotypical masculine tasks and one of them the more stereotypical feminine tasks, or are they doing things more androgynously? And in terms of differences for same-sex couples, this is changing a lot, but in some countries, same-sex couples don't have the same legal rights to marry or adopt, certainly are still experiencing the strains associated with heterosexism and homophobia. So I think about this, every time I walk around in Old Town holding my husband's hand, that I don't even have to think twice about exhibiting public affection. And if someone were to glance at my husband and I wouldn't think that they were questioning why we were holding hands or offended because we were showing affection. So just that kind of constant kind of daily strain, or the strain of deciding whether or not you have to come out or not, because maybe people are still tending to assume that everyone is straight. I notice this, for example, when I go through the Ace Hardware line, and maybe the nice, older man at the cash register says, "You get your husband to help you with that," right? And I don't have to tell him I don't have a husband, I have a wife, right? Because I'm straight, so I don't have that stress or strain of always kind of having to decide if I'm going to correct people. On average, the research on household labor, even though it's said that same-sex couples still have to navigate that, it has shown that they, in general, show more equity with paid work and household labor. Gay male couples have shown to, in general, have more open relationships or non-monogamous relationships, where one person might be the primary emotional partner, but you might be able to have other sexual partners. And for gay male couples, this has been correlated more with longevity in the relationship, so it hasn't seemed to hurt the primary relationship. And for same-sex individuals, you're more likely to have relationships that cross race, class, and age groups. So even though we learned about homogamy in relationships, that people are more likely to choose people who are like them in terms of these major demographic factors, for same-sex couples, there's less homogamy. And that could be because they've already kind of deconstructed difference, they have more tolerance for diversity, but it can also be because your dating pool is smaller, and so you're more likely to partner with someone who's different in one of these factors. Okay, so the number of people who are not having kids in the United States is increasing, and you can see there that in the year 2000, there was about 20% of women who were childless in their 40s. And that rate had gone up significantly since the 1970s. Of those who in their 40s, women who don't have kids, about not quite half of those are voluntarily childless, or as one of my voluntarily childless friends says, not childless, but child-free. And in general, being childless as a young adult is a good thing in terms of well-being. Childless young adults report higher emotional well-being on average than parents, probably because taking care of little kids is so hard. But by midlife, people who have kids and people who don't have similar levels of well-being. And by older age, there can be some advantages for people who did have kids, especially if they especially compared to people who maybe wanted to have kids who couldn't. So it does depend on what your choices were. But later in life, for people who wanted to have kids and didn't have kids, there could be lower levels of well-being. Okay, so let's talk about the transition to parenthood. So historically, parenting used to dominate much more of adult life due to our shorter lifespans and us having more children that were spread out through more of adulthood. Now it's more like 20 years or so, or about a third of adult life, and people are in developed countries generally delaying having kids. So the transition to parenthood can look different whether or not you're in a more traditional culture, which is kind of a developing rural culture, or a more developed culture. And so in traditional cultures, kids may still be important for obtaining status as an adult. Children can be seen as an economic resource, right? Someone to take care of other kids, or to, work on the crops or help out in the family business. Extended family are more responsible for caring kids, so this might be grandmothers or aunts, and it's generally women in traditional cultures who are taking care of kids. In developed cultures, we see parenting more, becoming a parent more as a choice. children are seen as not an economic resource, but an economic drain. And you can often see that the newspaper will list like what it costs to raise a child to the age of 18, in the United States, for example. There's less reliance on extended family to take care of kids, although that definitely varies. And we are more likely to see that both women and men are responsible for taking care of kids. Okay, so let's talk through some of the pros and cons to having kids. And when I was in my 20s, my husband and I went out to dinner with another couple, and we made a pro-con list like this on a napkin about having kids. And interestingly, we went on to have kids, and they didn't have kids. So some of the common pros to having children are that it gives you something to love and someone who hopefully will love you back. It can give your life a sense of meaning and purpose, can be kind of related to overall satisfaction with life. You can feel less selfish and more like you're helping, others, that sense of generativity. And it can make you feel like a responsible adult, both individually and society can perceive you more that way. The cons, and there's many, are of course that you have a lot less freedom. You can't just, leave a baby and head off to go out and have fun or run an errand or go exercise, or even small children. The time constraints. So suddenly you don't have enough time for yourself. The strain that it places on couple relationships because you don't have as much freedom, you don't have as much time, you're sleep deprived, which we'll talk about. There is so much more worry and fear. I often have said that parenting is basically a 3-decade exercise in fear. It starts as soon as you're pregnant and you're worrying about whether or not you're going to have a miscarriage, or worrying about whether or not your baby is going to have any abnormalities, or worrying about whether or not you're going to have a stillbirth or birth complications. And then it moves on to worrying about SIDS and choking and head trauma and, bullying and mental health issues and academic success. And then you get into adolescence and there's so many things to worry about there. And then you're worried about your kids and whether or not they're going to go to college or be successful or find a job that they can support themselves with and find a partner, right? So there's so many things to worry about. And of course, in developed countries, kids are associated with being a financial drain, so they're correlated with higher amounts of financial stress and less disposable income. And then, of course, reductions in sleep. And people often ask questions like, oh, is your baby sleeping through the night? And somebody will say, yeah, they're sleeping through the night at just a couple of months. And if you're not a parent, you think, oh, then I guess they're getting good sleep now. All is fine. But of course, sleeping through the night is really this misnomer. They're not really sleeping through the night. They're sleeping till like 5:30 or 6, and do you really want to get up at 5:30 or 6 always, including the weekends? And of course, every time they get sick, they're up in the night. And then once they start waking up in the night for a few days, then they'll do that for a couple of weeks before their sleep returns to normal. So I really felt like in having 2 kids just a few years apart that it was pretty much a whole decade of sleep deprivation. Okay, so let's talk more about parent divisions of labor with kids and how that is related to the marital relationship. And this research has largely been done on heterosexual couples. So in developed countries, as we're seeing, gender roles are less defined than in traditional cultures. And so we see both mothers and fathers caring for kids. Yet we do see, on average, that mothers perform more household labor and child care, and fathers are likely to work more hours. There was a book written in the 1990s called The Second Shift by Arlie Russell Hochschild, and coined this term, the second shift, was this idea that as women went into the workforce, it was initially thought that they would then share the household labor more readily with their husbands, but it turned out that a lot of women were working all during the day and then coming home and doing a lot more of the household labor in the evening compared to their husbands. And so that was called the second shift. What research says is that basically that second shift is decreasing. Everybody is performing less household labor, either they're hiring out or letting things go or getting more efficient kind of, food prep or cleaning devices. So that second shift for mothers is decreasing. Mothers now just have on average a little bit less leisure each week compared to fathers. So that's good news. So there's been a common finding that the transition to parenthood is correlated with decreases in marital satisfaction. And typically we might say that that is for about maybe 60% of couples will experience some decline in marital satisfaction, but maybe about 40% don't. So it's not everyone. It is a time where you're trying to figure out who's doing what, and there's definitely these societal roles of what it means to be a mother and a father. And so you could have been maybe more egalitarian before you had kids in how you were dividing paid and unpaid labor. But society kind of often, once you have a kid, you will feel this mantle of what it means to be a good father or a good mother kind of come down on your shoulders. And so if you're a father, suddenly you might feel like you need to be more of an ideal earner, or if you're a mother, you suddenly feel like you have to know how to do things like trim fingernails and give babies baths and, figure out the vaccination schedule and stuff like that. So it can be a time when gender roles can become more traditional, but again, not for everybody. It is because of the challenges in labor, the decrease in freedom, the decrease in sleep. It is a time of increased risk of resentment and depression in couples, especially for mothers, who often are bearing more of the responsibilities. And having involved fathers for heterosexual couples is beneficial both for the well-being of the mother, higher marital satisfaction, and also has benefits for kids over time. Okay, so around the world, single motherhood is more common than single fatherhood and is still rising. It's higher now than it was 50 years ago. And the reasons why we're seeing increases in single parents are first, more cohabitation. So sometimes people look like they get classified as a single parent even if they have a cohabiting partner. Also, it could be because people are delaying marriage, but yet not always delaying children. And this could be due to fears of fertility problems or fears of divorce, which are leading them to have kids but not, get married. And then divorce is also a factor, but again, divorce rates began to stabilize in the 1980s and single parenthood has continued to rise. So now our increases in single parenthood are due less to divorce and more about, delaying marriage or cohabiting instead of being married or choosing to live as a single parent. So it's been hard in research to figure out who is truly a single parent, as many single mothers, for example, are cohabiting or have maybe extended family assistance. But true single mothers, who are the only kind of adults in their home, do show a lot more challenges on average, as we could imagine. Less income, women are already earning less money on the dollar than men, and then single mothers earn even less. Single mothers of color earn even less. So you have less income, you're having to work longer work hours to support your family, which all kind of adds up to more life stress. You don't have the options, maybe your kids don't have as many options for after school activities because they're harder to afford and you can't kind of drive them places. Your kids might have to be in before school care and after school care, which can create more stress. Generally, kids can struggle more with emotional and behavioral problems. You might have more risk as the parent of anxiety, depression, and physical health challenges. And my friends who are single parents also say one of the challenges is just less. You don't have somebody always to make decisions about regarding your kids. You have people who are going to give you your input, but maybe they're not as invested in your children as you are.